Good afternoon, and thank you all for attending the 6th JASA webinar for 2022. As Helen just noted, I'm Victoria Melendez, a JASA Program Committee member working with dedicated members Amy Poster and Allison Tolman. For those of you who are new to JASA, our organization promotes the study and appreciation of Japanese art. Originally founded in 1973 as the Ukiyo-e Society of America by collectors of Japanese prints, JASA's mission has expanded to include related fields of Japanese art and scholarship. Through our webinars and other events, we aim to provide a forum through which members can exchange ideas with scholars, curators, collectors, and other experts about traditional and contemporary arts of Japan. The use of Zoom webinars has greatly expanded our geographic reach so that we are now able to host speakers from throughout the US and abroad. Today, we are very pleased to host a special webinar with Dr. Monika Binchik, the Diane and Arthur Abbey Associate Curator for Japanese Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Dr. Binchik will lead us through the exciting Metropolitan exhibition entitled Kimono Style, the John C. Weber collection, on view until February 20th of next year. A second rotation of textiles in the exhibition will start on October 22nd. Before we begin, I would like to call your attention to Dr. Binchik's fascinating interview with Dr. Weber that appeared in part 1 of the 2022 double issue of Impressions, number 43, as well as the glowing press reviews in Vogue, the New York Times, and the Art newspaper. Finally, please see the Met's beautiful catalog accompanying the exhibition, which features scholarly articles by Dr. Binchik, as well as Karen van Gotsenhoven, Arai Masanao, and Christine Kamiya. You can obtain the catalog at the Met's bookshop or online. Without further ado, please allow me to pass the podium to Dr. Binchik. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Vicky, and I would like to thank the JASA members and all the organizers for the kind invitation to be with you today. In the 1980s, during the years of Japan's bubble economy, several Japanese designers, including Issey Miyake, Yohji Yamamoto, and Rei Kawakubo, created waves of sensation in the Western fashion world as they redefined, questioned, and changed the direction of the meaning of fashion. They challenged the production process as well as the idea of a garment and what it represents. However, it was only around the 1860s that the Japanese started to wear Western-style clothing. This was a tumultuous century, and the island country went through major changes from the end of the Edo period through the Showa period. How did these changes lead to the phenomenon that non-Western designers could create avant-garde trends popular in the West? How the history of the kimono impacted these new fashion ideas? Is it possible to tell the history of the T-shaped garment in terms of modern fashion? The Kimono Style exhibition, featuring Dr. John C. Weber's collection of Japanese textiles, examined these questions and attempted to revisit the history of the kimono from the late Edo period through the 1930s. This project is a collaboration with the Met's Costume Institute, and I teamed up with Karen van Gotstenhoven to curate the exhibition. Karen is a fashion curator and a wonderful partner to work with. I would like to acknowledge her support as well as the help of many other colleagues from the Costume Institute. I also would like to recognize here Christine Kamiya, our textile conservator, whose dedicated work was essential to bring this project to fruition. It was only in the last decades of the 20th century that scholars began to raise the issue of the history of fashion as a global cultural phenomenon. The general assumption was that it did not exist outside of the West. One of the first authors to address the question was Eric Wolf in his seminal work, Europe and the People Without History, published in 1982. Following his arguments, fashion historians gradually turned their attention to the examination of Eurocentrism in the field. For example, Jennifer Craig proposed that non-Western dress has its own fashion system, and the word fashion needs to be revised. Fashion, broadly defined, as changing forms of dress that are adopted by a group of people at a given time and place existed in numerous cultures. We will demonstrate that many aspects of the Edo period fashion system in Japan were comparable to that of the European examples. From the second half of the 19th century, the development of fashion in Japan is closely connected to Western concepts, and we will highlight the strong influence of department stores and modern marketing strategies. The beginning of fashion is often identified as a way for the elite to distinguish themselves from those lower on the social scale, especially the merchants. Based on 16th and 17th century Italian sources, such as Baldassare Castiglione, the Book of the Courtier, published in 1528, the establishment of fashion can be seen as a social institution, and that of the meaning of clothing could be interpreted both at the personal and political level. We can see the development of a sophisticated system in Japan as well, where from the early Edo period, clothing styles were adjusted to the four-tier social hierarchy based on Neo-Confucian concepts. The word kimono first appears in written sources in the Kamakura period, but not as the name of a specific type of garment, but a general term describing clothing. However, in the Portuguese records of the Japanese lifestyle and habits dating from the 1570s, they refer to the kosode as kimono or kiru mono, something to wear. It is also noted that both men and women of all social rank wear the same type of garment. It is clear that they meant kosode. Throughout the Edo period, the kosode remained the most common type of garment. The style, material, colors, and patterns of the robes communicated information about marital status, gender, age, wealth, and social position. These variations in design, material, and style were tied to the four-tiered social system: samurai, farmers, craftsmen, and merchants. Edo culture had two important frameworks: gender and social position. Within this structure, women were often seen as secondary to men and commoners as inferior to samurai. The literal translation of the kosode is small sleeve. However, it does not refer to the size of the sleeve itself, but to the opening of the sleeve around the wrist. The origin of the term can be traced back to the Heian period, and it was used in contrast with osode, robes with large sleeve openings. The kosode was an undergarment worn under the osode, of which several layers were put on and combined in a sophisticated manner by the aristocratic ladies. Commoners wore kosode as both undergarment and outer clothing. From the Muromachi through the Momoyama period, when the military dominated the political scene, the samurai also began to wear kosode, and the elite preferred fine silk. Commoners typically would have owned hemp robes, and gradually, as the merchants gained more financial power over the years, they also became able to afford the expensive and luxurious silk. As Marsha Yonemoto observed and summarized the problem of women in the Edo period, I quote, "A learned woman was the essential foundation of a reputable household, yet an overly clever one was inclined to haughtiness and unseemly ambition. A cultivated and presentable woman was an asset to the family and society, while a flamboyantly attractive one was bound to stir up chaotic desires. Women's reproductive powers ensured all important perpetuation of a lineage over time, yet women's sexualized bodies consistently endangered the integrity of the household. In this way, through their actions, Tokugawa period women, like their Meiji successors, both challenged and reinforced dominant power structures." End of quote. At the beginning of the Edo period, it was only the elite's privilege to wear elegant, stylish, luxurious clothing, as it was a visual expression of high social rank. However, from around the Kane era, the mid-17th century, this was to change due to developments in textile industry, including the evolving cotton production, technical achievements in dyeing and weaving, in addition to the general advancement of transportation, trade networks, and the flourishing economy. These factors created an environment that facilitated quick changes in clothing styles, supported by large drapery shops, sophisticated distribution of visual information, and the appearance of star designers. The Tokugawa shogunate repeatedly issued sumptuary laws to regulate the materials, decorative techniques, especially the luxurious and expensive ones that can be used by the specific classes, especially the chonin, the townspeople. But appearances and expenses of the daimyo and samurai were also controlled. In 1657, after the Great Fire of Meireki in Edo, regulations were issued to control the colors and styles of decorations that merchants could wear. Soon after, in 1683, 7 more edicts were issued and more followed in the 18th century. However, these regulations were not always strictly enforced, and the townspeople were able to find ways around them. Sumptuary laws actually had a strong influence on fashion, as materials not regulated became popular, just as well as the methods to circumvent the use of the forbidden techniques or dyes. In the 16th, 17th century Italy, the appearances were regulated by law. It became necessary due to the emergence of a wealthy and influential bourgeoisie. Ironically, some of the representatives of the new money were the textile merchants due to the prominent role of silk, cotton, and wool manufacturing in Italy. The Venetian Senate forbade women from wearing dresses made with linings made of gold and silver fabric, and the women responded by adopting a fashion in which sleeve linings were made from the prohibited material, worn with the sleeves slashed to reveal the splendid lining. This reaction is quite similar to the Japanese trick to line the kimonos with expensive, luxurious silks. Gofuku in the Edo period refers to high-quality kosode, especially made of silk, fine hemp, jofu, which were sold at the dry goods or drapery stores, while cotton, ponji, or tsumugi were called futomono, or drapery. Silk kosode, including plain wave, satin, rinzu, and so on, were typically made for order. The Gofuku shop's clients were principally samurai men and women and wealthy merchant men and women. Commoners with low income and farmers were mainly making their own clothing, either from cotton or best fiber they cultivated themselves or perhaps purchased. They also could use tsumugi silk. The way the kosoda orders were made were different for each social class. For high-ranking samurai household, a man in charge of the wardrobe arranged the order with the gofukuya. For example, the Echizen Matsudaira family regularly ordered clothing from the Echigoya shop. The orders were carefully recorded. However, perhaps for low-ranking samurai families, it could have been that the representative of the gofukuya visited the home and directly took the orders there. The opening scene of the Hinagata Chumoncho, the Hinagata order book from 1716, shows a samurai residence, and at the veranda, a samurai attendant is having a conversation with the order taker discussing kosoda patterns, while women are looking at woodblock printed pattern books and discussing the designs. Typically, a senior lady in waiting, Roju, was in charge of the wardrobe of the women in high-ranking samurai households, and she put in the orders. The lady in waiting briefly described what was needed, and based on this, the Gofukusho created a detailed plan, including a rough sketch of the robe with the patterns depicted. The payment was also handled by the lady in waiting. Except for rare occasions, the elite samurai women were not seen in public. In the slide, you can see a beautiful summer garment for a high-ranking samurai lady from the Tokugawa family from the late Edo period. The pattern books, which were used for the orders of samurai women, but Basically, these were individualized hand-painted sketches created by the Gofukusho to assist with the selection. The actual execution of the order had several steps. The selected bolt of undyed fabric was cut and temporarily stitched together in the shape of the required garment, and the underdrawing was completed on the fabric. Then the piece was taken apart and sent around to as many specialized craftsmen as necessary, various dyers, embroidery specialists, gold foil application, and so on. The garment was later adjusted and sewn together in its final form. When completed with its lining, it was carefully examined, compared with the final order, and the date of completion and the cost of the execution was recorded. Finally, the garment was sent out and um, accompanied with an accompanied statement of delivery. On the other hand, Chonin women, the merchant class wives, had more freedom to decide what to wear, as they had no official positions, such the samurai families. Their outfits were supposed to reflect their social position, financial situation, and conform to the sanctuary laws. These rules, however, were often neglected for the sake of being fashionable or showing off wealth. The orders were placed directly by the women, either at the gofukuya or in the comfort of their homes. They could decide what ground fabric to pick, which patterns to wear, and what technique to use for the decoration. The shop representatives had an active role in the discussion of the design, and woodblock printed pattern books, hinagatabon, were used in the process to assist with this decision. The example on the screen is an uchikake from the second half of the 18th century for a merchant class lady, decorated with a willow tree at the back and a beautifully embroidered Chinese poem over the sleeves. The hinagatabon were available in the bookshop in large cities along with other literary publications. They were quite similar to today's fashion magazines and primarily used by Chonin women and also by wakashu, as demonstrated by this detail. In the Nishikawa Hinagata, we can see a couple jointly designing a stylish kosode. The execution of the order was very similar to the above-mentioned process for the samurai women. However, there are no surviving written documentation of the process. From 1666 to 1820, approximately 180 kosode pattern books or hinagatabon were published. As the woodblock printed books are dated, they serve as essential resources to date popular patterns and the changes in the distribution of the motifs on the surface of the kosode. They also document the development of dyeing and decorative techniques. For example, in the Genji Hinakata published in 1687, 27 types of dyeing is recorded. Most of the books include black and white drawings of the T-shaped garments shown from the back. However, some depicts the robes worn by women to indicate their appropriate style and the type of women they fit best. For example, seen on the On Hinagata Manjoshu, published in 1673. These illustrations, especially the ones showing the women themselves, are distinctly related to paintings known as bijinga, representing beauties. Most of the patterns were created by unknown designers, but well-known ukiyo-e artists, such as Hishikawa Moronobu and Nishikawa Sukenobu, also produced Hinagata books. Most of the pattern books were published in Kyoto, which was not only a major textile production center, but also a hub of publishing woodblock printed books. The surviving examples of garments that could be matched with patterns published in the books testify that the individual taste of the customer defined the colors and modifications to the design. It seems that the goal was to be fashionable, following the latest trends, at the same time to have a distinct individual taste. In Europe, fashion spread through skilled artisans who traveled between Italy, France, the Netherlands, and England. They had a major role in the distribution of technical innovations as well as fashion trends. The tailor's book, Il Libro del Sarto, attributed to Giovanni Jacopo del Conte, published in Milan in 1570, is comparable to a modern fashion catalog and to the Hinagatabons. It is a portfolio and sketchbook showing men and women's fashionable dresses. The paintings helped the customers to select garments they desired. The fashion trends in Japan were summarized in the Onna Chohoki, first published in 1692. I quote, "As regards the designs on women's clothing among the elite, like the imperial court nobility, things today have scarcely changed from olden times. But if a samurai wife went out dressed in a kosode with old-fashioned patterns with a lot of gold and silver thread embroidery on red and white backgrounds like donsu, shuchin, or rinzu style, or with a fawn-spotted design, so kanoko, she'd look like a country bumpkin and people in the capital would laugh at her. Styles in the capital change according to the times. From time to time, certain dye patterns are very popular, but within 5 or 8 years, everyone has abandoned them." End of quote. Women's education, lifestyle, role in the society were all captured on the surface of their robes. Both the designers of the patterns and the clients reacted sensitively to shifts in culture, society, economic challenges, sumptuary laws, and numerous other individual factors such as the marital status or age of the women. One of the long-standing arguments for the lack of fashion in Asia, including Japan, is that the garments, particularly the kimono, has been changeless. The main reason for that is that most of the historians base their ideas on changes in tailoring, a key aspect in European styles, and did not consider the changes of motifs, decorative techniques, or fabrics, which are the key elements of kimono fashion. Now let's have a look at the taste of Edo period men. Specialized apparel for men worn to conduct dangerous tasks, whether fighting enemy soldiers or fighting fires, exemplifies the fusion and function in fashion. Japan high-ranking samurai had access to the finest of materials, and they used battle surcoats, the jimbaori, to project status and individual taste. Jimbaori, produced from about the 15th through the mid-19th century, were sleeveless garments originally worn over armor as protection from the rain, wind, and cold, and they eventually became ceremonial wear. They were decorated with flamboyant, boldly colored designs to increase visibility, facilitate identification, and express valor, and also with religious symbols to invoke divine protection and good outcomes. Samurai generally wore them when on campaign and traveling by horse. The arrival of the Portuguese in 1543 brought significant changes to samurai battle wear, owing to both new forms of warfare and access to new materials and designs. The most suitable material for a durable, visibly striking, and warm battle coat was wool, which in the 17th century could not be produced in Japan and had to be imported from Europe. Russia, from the Portuguese Russia, word is a thick, plain weave wool fabric with net surface. It arrived pre-dyed, most popularly in a deep scarlet derived from cochineal and tin mordant. For this jimbaori, a cochineal from the Americas, most likely Mexico, was used. The surcoat has an elongated shape, and the decorative sword support or tachioke is sewn to the upper shoulder. At the center of the back is a cutout and finely stitched white applique in the shape of a Chinese-style military signal fan, touchiwa or gumbai. It appears to be a decorative pattern and not a family crest. This other jimbaori, a thick wool fabric, was dyed with black logwood. The lining is a brocaded red silk with silver threads, ginran, woven in a Polonia arabesque pattern. At the back of the jimbaori, directly above the slit, is the pattern of a tattered fan in white wool applique and gold embroidery. Battle fans had crucial roles in giving signals on the battlefield and were believed to have the ability to summon deities, good luck, and spiritual powers. This unusual tattered fan motif might signify a military commander's determination to keep fighting and never to retreat, no matter how injured. It also suggests the fragility of life. Decoration was also important to firefighters' garments, which were far from purely utilitarian uniforms. Firefighters enjoyed respect and high status, especially in Edo, where wooden architecture and crowded living conditions led to frequent outbreaks of fire. Firefighters and the areas for which they were responsible in Edo were classified according to social status, and samurai firefighters and chonin firefighters were distinguished. The luxurious red wool jacket worn by a high-ranking samurai woman on fire duty is extravagantly decorated with crashing waves, water droplets, and anchors in embroidery on white satin weave silk applique. The dynamic composition refers to the process of extinguishing a fire and pulling down smoldering buildings. 5 crests with a motif of 3 oak leaves, possibly the Yamauchi family crest, are depicted in gold thread on the jacket. The hood, embellished with the same patterns, testifies that this set was made for a woman, as male firefighters wore helmets. A matching plastron and hakama pants would have completed the ensemble. High-ranking samurai women, especially those living in the women's quarter of Edo Castle, the Ooku, were trained to evacuate and assist people during fires. I'm showing a detail of the beautiful gold thread embroidery and the white silk satin ground. The commoners wore reversible coats, hikeshibanten, made of several layers of thick, quilted cotton fabric with a plain indigo dyed exterior and an elaborately decorated interior. For fighting fires, these cotton coats were soaked in water and worn with the plain side facing out, and they were worn inside out after the fire was extinguished or during festivals. Woodblock prints of warrior heroes and mythical creatures, especially those by Utagawa Kuniyoshi, inspired many of the jacket's interior designs. Kuniyoshi, one of the most popular print artists of the time, came from a family of textile dyers, giving him a good sense for fashion trends. In this jacket, you can see the warrior Yoshikado, who is asking a frog sage for magical powers so he can avenge the murder of his father. For this farmer's jacket, strips of cotton were reused as wefts, woven together with warps of mountain wisteria in a plain wave technique known as sakiori. This method began as a means of recycling old textiles, mainly cotton, which were too valuable to discard. Often, women wove sakiori textiles on a traditional backstrap loom, using a heavy button to beat down the thick weft. By the mid and late Edo period, the chonin gradually increased their financial influence and accumulated wealth, but remained without political power, while the warrior class could not increase their income, which was primarily based on the land properties of the daimyo. This imbalance contributed to the eventual collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate in the mid-19th century and to the Meiji reforms. Clothing well reflected the structure and characteristics of the Japanese society, and the historical and social changes immediately could be detected in the ever-changing kosode designs. In the Meiji period, kimono became a general term to describe the Japanese clothing against the Western-style apparel, which was progressively accepted from the 1860s, 1870s. For the Westerners, the kimono became a cultural marker, and they identified it as the national costume of Japan. One of the first shops to sell Western clothing for women was the Shirokiya in Tokyo, purveyors to the imperial household. The business, which began as a gofukuya, in 1662 in Edo, quickly adjusted to the times and in 1886 announced that it had hired its first female tailor from England and had started to take orders for women's apparel. Mitsukushi, which was founded in 1673 under the name Echigoya by Mitsui Takatoshi, started to sell Western clothing in 1888. It was among the first Japanese department stores to adopt Western business and marketing methods, drawing upon its executive studies of the John Wanamaker department store in Philadelphia and the Harrods in London. Takashimaya, which was founded in Kyoto in 1831 as a small gofukuten by Ida Shinshichi, was also early to adopt Western retail practices. Its Kyoto branch was Japan's first store to install plate glass windows in 1896 and shortly thereafter added kimono-clad mannequins to the window displays. The company had by then already become a pioneer of the export trade, bringing Japanese textiles to the world market as early as 1876. In the following decades, Takashimaya representatives traveled throughout Europe and the United States, visiting international expositions and textile factories, exploring business opportunities. They recommended that Takashimaya designs export products, especially for the Western customer, such as this hybrid coat inspired by the shape of the kimono, also inspired by Chinese mandarin robes, but decorated with traditional Japanese style embroidery, showing a peacock, which was in line with the Art Nouveau taste. Japan, spurred by the Japanism movement in the West, produced dressing gowns expressly for the foreign market. The Yokohama silk merchant, Shiino Shobei, had been dispatched to the Vienna World's Fair, and his research resulted in the Yokohama robes named for the port from which they were shipped. They were Western in shape, but made with Japanese decorative patterns and using habutai silk. I'm showing a detail of how we dressed the Yokohama robe in the Costume Institute studio, showing the mannequins. European designers in the early 20th century looked to other cultures and epochs for alternatives to the constrictive S-shaped Edwardian silhouette. Most were familiar with the kimono through ukiyo-e prints. In 1903, French couturier Paul Poiret made his first loose dress with hints of the kimono shape, and by 1906 he had presented his first collection to be worn without a corset. Poiret's self-confessed lack of sewing skills pushed him to experiment with sculpting fluid garments directly on the body. The designer's Paris opera coat, a 15-foot length of silk velvet, is draped into shape without any cutting. Devoid of decoration except for the placket at the hip line, it is a masterwork of modernist simplicity. As a reminder, kimonos are made of a single bolt of fabric called ten, which is typically about 12 meters long and 35 centimeters wide, and it is used entirely to make one garment with almost no waste of the material. This warp dress with a dramatic floral lame motif was created by the French female-led couture house Calosseur, known for their use of non-Western experimental approaches to dress. Much as the kimono is constructed from a single bolt of fabric, the dress hangs from a central point at the bust and twisted around the body on the bias in a continuous ribbon to culminate in a dramatic train. French couturier Madeleine Vionnet collected and displayed on her atelier walls Japanese woodblock prints. The designer's innovative bias cut technique, by which she enveloped the body with fabric that clings and yet stretches with physical movement, was based on the rectangular structure of the kimono. And now, back to Japan. The department store companies, such as the Mitsukushi, also invested in comprehensive market and product research to support the creation of contemporary fashions, and in advertising, in-house magazines, and in-store events to promote them. Mitsukushi promoted its fashions through lavishly illustrated, self-published magazines in the mold of the Harrods Catalog and Harper's Bazaar. These publications played an important role in conveying the latest trends, much as the Edo period Hinagata-bon had done. All these retail showmanship was aimed not only at selling merchandise, but also at establishing Mitsukoshi as a trendsetter, merging elements of the Eastern and Western fashion system, also as we can see in the moga or modern girls' lifestyle. Kimono patterns in the early to mid-20th century increasingly drew from Western art movements, including the sinuous, organic patterns characteristic of Art Nouveau and the bold geometric forms of Art Deco, which were both influenced by Japanese art. Eventually, repeating motifs replaced intricate decorative compositions inspired by Japanese literature. You can also see that it took several conservators to dress the mannequin, and we, especially for this show, acquired matching obi and accessories to dress up the dragonfly kimono. The modernization of the Japanese fashion system took place first in textile production. After the collapse of the shogunate, global trade and industrialization in the second half of the 19th century expanded Japan's access to expensive or restricted wool, cotton, and new technologies, such as silk reeling machines and silk spinning technologies. In 1897, the Shimmachi silk spinning mill was acquired by the Mitsui clan, which had established one of the most prominent industrial and financial business conglomerates in Japan, including the Mitsukushi department store. Machine spun silk, power looms, and aniline or chemical dyes all contributed to the creation of affordable, stylish kimonos made from mason, an inexpensive silk woven from pre-dyed yarns through a technique known as ikat and kasuri, and these were promoted by the big department stores such as Matsuzakaya or Mitsukoshi. By the 1920s and 1930s, working and middle-class women from high school students to shop assistants could buy casual, bright-colored, ready-to-wear modern kimonos with bold graphic patterns. Department stores frequently released new designs to spark trends and inspire purchases. Western-style marketing techniques, such as mannequin girls, were employed to advertise the seasonal designs. The Mason kimonos were very affordable, and the department stores organized sales to further drive down the prices. The traditional method of making tied resist or shibari kasuri by hand is to stretch a bundle of 20 to 30 yarns between two upright rods, tightly wrap the parts that should remain undyed with cotton threads or hemp fibers, and immerse the bundle in a dye bath. After the yarns are washed and dried, the wrapped areas are released, revealing the patterns in white. The method creates straight-edged geometric patterns, but cannot produce curves or large pictorial compositions. In the ogasuri, or large ikat version of this technique, which was developed in Isesaki, both the warp and weft threads were tied resist dyed. The blurry edges are typical of the kasuri technique, as the patterns dyed into the yarns could not be perfectly aligned on the loom. You can see that even a gold thread weft was added for a feel of luxury. This Mason kimono was inspired by Piet Mondrian's paintings. The Art Nouveau and Art Deco styles from the West, themselves influenced by Japanese art, had a major impact on Mason motifs, as did Western modernist movements such as Cubism, the Dutch, the Still, and Italian Futurism. Manufacturing reached its peak in the 1930s with intense competition among production centers north of Tokyo, such as Chichibu, Ashikaga, Kiryu, driving new processes and dyeing techniques to reduce costs and increase output. Also, to create complex compositions, including curvilinear patterns with multiple colors, popular both with young women and female students, such as the student from the Ochanomizu University on the right side of the slide. This idea was simplified for industrial production in 1906 with the patented method of stencil printing pictorial patterns on warp threads. Before dyeing the warp yarns, temporary wefts were sparsely interwoven to keep the warps in place. The fabric was stretched on a textile dyeing table and printed with stencils. After steaming to fix the colors, the temporary wefts were removed one section at a time while on the loom, leaving only the warps patterned, and the fabric was rewoven with unpatterned and monochrome permanent weft yarns. The unraveling of the temporary wefts gave the technique its name hobushi, or unraveled fasuri. This technique facilitated the production of complex curvilinear motifs such as the rabbits on this pink kimono. For this lively pattern, 5 stencils were prepared to apply the colors to the warp: gray, yellow, deep green, black, and dark pink. The weft is all the black. Posters featuring popular actresses were used to promote Meisen kimonos. The increasing popularity of synthetic fibers, the waning use of kimonos for daily wear, and the flourishing market for Western-style clothing seized the market for Meisen, and it completely declined after 1955. And now back to the West to wrap up my presentation. Cristobal Balenciaga's work with volume and abstraction revolutionized the fashionable hourglass silhouette of French style. The cocoon shape of the back of this dramatic pink silk satin wrap alludes to the way an overrobe, uchikake, creates an elegant arc over the obi worn with the kimono. In emphasizing the nape of the neck by dropping the bias rolled collar, Balenciaga evokes the kimono's neckline, which dips at the back. Hanae Mori, the pioneering post-wear designer, known for making Western-style clothes for the Japanese market, also presented evening garments inspired by kimonos at New York Fashion Week in 1965. Her signature style was sophisticated and feminine, stimulated by Edo period fashions. The ukiyo-e dress exemplifies Mori's incorporation of Japanese popular culture into Western-style evening wear, enhanced with exquisite beading and embroidery. Rei Kawakubo revolutionized Western fashion in the 1980s with deconstructed garments composed of layers of fabric. Her radical designs broke away from conventional forms of dress. Yohji Yamamoto blends the generous proportions of the kimono with Western shapes. The humble T-shaped coat with flower-shaped cutouts references the Japanese wabi-sabi concept, an appreciation of simplicity and impermanence. With this garment, the designer intentionally explored the visible traces of time. In this floor-sweeping dress for Maison Margiela artisanal line, designer John Galliano pays tribute to the elegance of the kimono, a garment that has inspired several of his creations over the years. This dress in synthetic fabric also quotes the kimono's draped collar at the nape of the neck and the obi-like sash tied at the center back. And finally, with the revolutionary A Piece of Cloth, or APOC line, Issey Miyake realized his lifelong aim of making garments based on the Japanese principle of constructing kimonos from a single bolt of cloth. You can see the piece hanging on the wall at the back of the slide. A democratic approach to self-tailoring mass-produced garments, APOC draws the customer into the act of creation and effectively materializes utopian ideas of a seasonless, genderless, waistless, and sizeless garment. Produced from tubes of fabric based on the kimono's basic cylindrical structure, the garment can be cut without unraveling along the pre-knitted dotted seams as the wearer wishes. This dark blue example is an uncut length from a larger roll. As you can see in the compositions by Rei Kawakubo, Balenciaga, Alexander McQueen, Issey Miyake, since the second half of the 20th century, the kimono's iconic structure has been a source of inspiration in global fashion. Some modern designers use its shape as a starting point for architecturally constructed garments, while others play with the kimono's symbolic associations. Japanese designers active in the West remix and reinterpret the kimono, reflecting Japanese culture to the world and back at itself. Alternative interpretations by Western designers, pushed to experimental heights by Japanese designers, create an endless play of adaptation, mutation, and variation. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, so thank you, Monika. I have to start my video now, so excuse me for 1 second while I do that. All right. Thank you for this wonderful lecture and so full of information. There were a number of questions. The first one is a historical question, which is what prompted the traditional wardrobe to change? Specifically, the questioner asks, was it the arrival of Commodore Perry in the mid-19th century to open Japan up to trade that pressured society to ultimately move to more Western wear?
Yes, certainly the Meiji reforms and the opening of the Japanese ports for trade changed the lifestyle in Japan. Of course, political and social changes were happening at the same time, and Western dress was adapted first by high-ranking samurai, the emperor and empress, and gradually by officials, and finally by women. And as I mentioned in my presentation, the technical changes that also happened by the importation of aniline dyes from the West, or silk reeling machines had an impact on the production of silk, cotton, and wool. So it all had an impact on the changes of Japanese styles and the type of garments that were stylish and fashionable.
Great, thank you. Another question was on how the wearing style of kimono has changed over time and whether it had an effect on pattern designs. Specifically, the question notes that in ukiyo-e and pattern books, the kimonos have more of a draped feel with the lower part of the kimono sometimes flaring out, but now the kimono is more tightly wrapped around the body. So that was just a question on the style changes.
Right. So the predecessor of the modern kimono, the kosode, which was the main type of garment in the Edo period. As you could see in my slide, it was much wider, shorter, and generally speaking, it was a very loose garment held together by a thin obisash. And it was like a very comfortable robe. Later, with the changes of patterns and fashion, the kimono gets longer, narrower, and the size of the obi is changing. It's getting wider. And with time, to save money around the waist, the Japanese did not apply patterns. So the obi, which became more decorative, covered the waist area, and the patterns drifted to either the shoulders or to the hem. It all changes with time. The second half of the question about the flaring of the hem, in most ukiyo-e prints, very elegant courtesans are depicted in expensive uchikake overrobes. And those uchikake were not held together by obi, those are put on top of your kosode or kimono. So the shape is relatively open, and it has a more sort of spacious feel. It's not as tight as the later modernized kimono shape.
Okay, thank you. There were two questions on pigments. The first question was on the international trade for pigments. And was the trade of pigments from Mexico, such as cochineal, an important part of Portuguese imports to Japan in the Edo period?
So for the Jimbori, the wool, of course, was produced in Europe, and they dyed the fabric in Europe. So the cochineal was available through South America, mainly from Mexico to the Europeans, and the Japanese received the pre-dyed garments or the pre-dyed fabric. The import of the aniline dyes, which really transformed the way the kimono looked, began in the Meiji period with the discovery of the movine, the purple, and then with other colors, the Japanese were able to reduce the price because the plant-based natural dyes were very expensive and time-consuming, and the chemical dyes facilitated very bright colors. Actually, there is a talk about the influence of aniline dyes on modern kimono design related to the John C. Weber exhibition with Marco Leona, our chief scientist, and the talk is available on YouTube and also on the Met's website. It's an insight talk. So if you are interested in the history of the natural dyes and the aniline dyes, please look up the talk, because Marco did a wonderful chronology of the timeline of the introduction of the aniline dyes to Japanese textile and print art.
Thank you. And the other question on pigment concerned the color purple. And the person, Susan Kastner, asks, purple was one of the colors banned for lower classes. Were there other colors that were banned? Also, were there dyeing techniques besides shibori that were banned?
So some of the expensive dyes, and purple is a good example because the Murasaki root was expensive, and the production of the purple was expensive, is one of the top colors that was regulated, but also the red, which was produced from safflower, which was also very expensive and luxurious. So for example, in the exhibition, we have a beautiful red kosode, which is a wedding garment for a young samurai bride, colored with safflower, and it is not faded. It has this original bright red color, which is just amazing. And you had to pick pounds and pounds of the flower petal to create just a little amount of dye. So it was more expensive than gold. So the red was one of those pigments, and the tie dye, the shibori, especially the kanoko shibori, the very small fawn spotted tie dyeing technique, was really time consuming. To create a garment completely covered in this method takes a very long time and requires skill. So the so kanoko shibori was one of the techniques that was banned for the chonin at the beginning of the Edo period, and later on even samurai women switched to the printed version, the suribita, which was the imitation of the tie dyeing. And on garments for Tokugawa princesses, we can see the printed version, and only for expensive garments they could use the actual tie-dyed shibori.
Thank you. Another question is on the kimono design. And the question is, would you say that kimono design continued to be inspired by the Western fashion after Art Nouveau and Art Deco period, or has it ended as kimono became more of a celebratory wear in Japan?
Well, it's difficult to answer because after the Second World War, many women started to switch to Western styles, Western clothing. So the kimono gradually became more like a special event or a special occasion wear. So either you inherited one from your mom and you could still put it on, but it was a little old-fashioned but beautifully made. And there were workshops in Kyoto that were producing older patterns like auspicious images. At the same time, there were kimono designs that were relatively modern, but with time, less and less kimono were needed. And because it became a special occasion wear, it became more celebratory. So the designs also reflected that. So it's yes or no, but there are kimono designers, especially, for example, the living national treasure Moriguchi Kunihiko, who was trained in Paris as a designer, and he creates abstract geometric patterns in traditional hand-painted yuzen, so combines an old Edo technique with a very contemporary and fresh so-called Western style pattern. So there are exceptions as well.
Thank you. Another question is whether how familiar you are with contemporary kimono patterns and designs, and how you think they compare to Edo fashion.
So I'm always very happy to see contemporary designs, and in Kyoto there are shops specializing in the modernization or sort of updating kimonos. So there is a shop that makes kimono out of jean fabric, and there are, of course, contemporary designs inspired by contemporary culture or anime or even motifs from Africa. And it's really open now, and there are young female designers. So it's a really exciting scene right now. And I'm hoping that because kimono is a thing to wear, it's really open to experimentation and open to all kinds of new ideas. And I do hope that young women will develop more interest in exploring interesting ways to put a kimono on, even if it's with high heels, even if they cut it short. There are many, many ways to play with it.
Well, actually, one of the last questions that came up is about younger people wearing kimono, and specifically from Susan Castor, who's asked a lot of questions, very interesting questions. Are the mini kimono currently worn by Shibuya girls considered a fashionable innovation or an anomaly?
I don't know whether it's a passing style or it's going to remain. I have seen mini skirt like kimonos in Kyoto at the Gion festival as well, with slippers. I mean, all kinds of combinations.
Right.
So I believe that there is a sort of revolution in that sense, that it's also something that young women want to try out, and why not?
Thank you. Well, I wish I could get to all of the questions, but literally it's 5:59. So I think unless there's anything else that you want to note, Monika, I think we probably need to be drawing to a close.
Thank you so much. Finally, I would like to thank John C. Weber and Julia Meach for all the help and support to make this project happen. And I do hope that this exhibition will help to introduce kimono to the American audience in a new context. And thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. We're really grateful. Bye-bye.